Eleanor Vance, a successful woman of 60, stood on the precipice of a new beginning. Her life, once consumed by the relentless pursuit of business success, had taken an unexpected turn. She had found love, a whirlwind romance with a younger man, Julian Thorne, whose charm had swept her off her feet and into the promise of a future she hadn't dared to dream of. 2 days after they exchanged vows, a chilling truth would shatter that idyllic facade, plunging her into a nightmare she never saw coming. Eleanor had always been a force to be reckoned with in the corporate world. Decades of dedication, sleepless nights, and strategic brilliance had built her empire from the ground up. Her relentless ambition and unwavering focus had propelled her to the top, but the price of success had been steep. Her marriage, a casualty of the long hours and emotional distance, had crumbled beneath the weight of her professional life. By the time the divorce papers were signed, she was left with a hollow ache, a void that no amount of professional triumph could fill. Retirement, a word that once held the promise of leisurely days and newfound freedom, felt strangely unsettling. Despite her financial security and comfortable lifestyle, Eleanor found herself adrift, the silence of her large, empty house amplifying the loneliness that had been her constant companion for years. The bustling life she once knew had faded, replaced by a quiet desperation she rarely acknowledged, a yearning for connection, for someone to share the simple joys and quiet moments with. Though she craved companionship, Eleanor was cautious. Life had taught her valuable lessons, especially when it came to matters of the heart. The idea of a relationship with a younger man, someone decades her junior, seemed almost absurd, a notion she quickly dismissed whenever it crossed her mind. She had received attention from younger men in the past, but she had always rebuffed their advances, attributing their interest to misguided intentions or something other than genuine affection. Her dignity and self-respect were her armor, protecting her from the potential vulnerabilities of such an unconventional pairing. Then, Julian Thorne entered her life. At 29, he was everything a confident younger man could be. Charismatic, attentive, impeccably dressed, and radiating an air of effortless charm. But beneath the polished exterior lay a darkness, a carefully concealed past that would soon unravel, revealing the true nature of the man who had so skillfully captured Eleanor's heart. Julian was a master manipulator, his life a carefully constructed tapestry of lies and deceit, woven together to ensnare vulnerable women like Eleanor. He had a history, a dark and disturbing pattern of behavior that had left a trail of broken hearts, financial ruin, and even death in its wake. Their first encounter was at a local charity gala, a summer evening filled with the promise of warm breezes and philanthropic endeavors. Eleanor, attending more out of obligation than genuine interest, wasn't looking for romance. As she sipped her wine, surveying the room with a detached politeness, she barely registered Julian's presence. But Julian had noticed her. He had watched her from across the room, his keen eyes assessing her every move, cataloging her vulnerabilities, and recognizing the subtle signs of loneliness that radiated from her despite the elegant smile and polite conversations. He saw in her a perfect target, a woman ripe for the picking, her wealth and isolation making her an ideal candidate for his carefully crafted scheme. Julian's approach was casual, disarming. He initiated conversation with a light-hearted remark about the event, his tone respectful, his demeanor charming yet unassuming. He carefully avoided any overt display of romantic interest, knowing that a premature advance might trigger Eleanor's defenses. Instead, he focused on building rapport, engaging her in conversations about her life, her passions, and her accomplishments. He listened intently, offering thoughtful responses and insightful observations that made Eleanor feel seen and understood. He learned about her successful career, the sacrifices she had made, and the quiet loneliness that had settled into her life since her retirement. He discovered her love for art, her passion for travel, and her quiet yearning for companionship. With each conversation, Julian gathered more information, each detail a valuable tool in his arsenal of manipulation. Over the following weeks, Julian orchestrated a series of chance encounters, each one meticulously planned to further solidify his presence in Eleanor's life. He would appear at her favorite coffee shop, accidentally bump into her at the local bookstore, or strike up a conversation at community events. Each encounter felt natural, unplanned, further eroding Eleanor's initial reservations. He showered her with attention, small gestures of kindness that chipped away at the walls she had built around her heart. A bouquet of her favorite flowers left on her doorstep, a thoughtful note slipped into her mailbox. A surprise visit with a warm cup of tea on a rainy afternoon, each gesture a carefully calculated move in his game of seduction. Eleanor, starved for affection and genuine connection, found herself drawn to his warmth and attentiveness, the small acts of kindness resonating deeply within her lonely heart. Julian's charm was not merely superficial. He possessed a keen intellect and a disarming ability to connect with Eleanor on an intellectual level. He engaged her in discussions about literature, art, and philosophy, making her feel appreciated and intellectually stimulated. He listened patiently as she shared stories from her past, her dreams, and her regrets, offering words of encouragement and understanding that resonated deeply within her. He validated her experiences, her successes, and even her vulnerabilities, making her feel cherished and valued in a way she hadn't felt in years. He painted a picture of a shared future, a life filled with companionship, travel, and intellectual pursuits. He spoke of quiet evenings spent reading together, of exploring exotic destinations, and of growing old together, sharing stories and creating memories. He made her believe that he saw her, not as an aging woman nearing the end of her life, but as a vibrant, intelligent, and desirable companion, worthy of love and admiration. Eleanor, against her better judgment, began to fall under his spell. The carefully constructed walls around her heart crumbled under the weight of his persistent charm and attentiveness. The loneliness that had haunted her for so long began to recede, replaced by a burgeoning hope, a belief that she had finally found the companionship she had craved. She convinced herself that her initial reservations were unfounded, that Julian's affection was genuine, and that she deserved this unexpected happiness. But while Eleanor saw a blossoming romance, a second chance at love, Julian saw something entirely different. He saw an opportunity, a pathway to financial security paved with Eleanor's trust and vulnerability. He had played this game before, and he knew exactly how to manipulate her emotions, how to exploit her loneliness, and how to weave himself into the fabric of her life, all the while concealing his true intentions behind a mask of love and devotion. Julian's true nature was that of a predator, a chameleon who adapted his persona to match the desires and vulnerabilities of his targets. Eleanor was not his first victim. Over the past 3 years, he had perfected a sinister scheme, targeting wealthy, older women, showering them with affection, marrying them, and then, shortly after, becoming the sole beneficiary of their estates through a series of unfortunate accidents. Each wife had met an untimely end, a sudden heart attack, an unexplained fall, a rapidly progressing illness. Julian had mourned each loss convincingly, playing the role of the grieving husband to perfection, all the while secretly celebrating his ill-gotten gains. He had erased his tracks meticulously, changing his name and fabricating a new identity for each conquest. He was a ghost, a phantom moving from town to town, leaving behind a trail of broken hearts and shattered lives. Eleanor was merely the latest pawn in his twisted game, the 5th victim in his macabre dance of deception. With Eleanor, his plan was even more insidious. He knew of her heart condition, the medication she relied on to maintain her health. He saw in her pre-existing condition an opportunity to expedite his scheme, to hasten her demise without leaving any trace of his involvement. He began subtly tampering with her medication, replacing her heart pills with placebos, harmless substitutes that would gradually weaken her, making her more susceptible to a fatal cardiac event. He continued his charade, showering her with affection, whispering sweet nothings in her ear, reinforcing the illusion of a loving husband devoted to his wife's well-being. He watched her with a chilling detachment as her health subtly declined, his feigned concern masking the cold calculation beneath the surface. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, patiently waiting for the moment to strike, the moment when Eleanor's wealth would finally be his. The proposal came just weeks after their first meeting, a whirlwind declaration of love that swept Eleanor off her feet. Over a candlelit dinner, Julian knelt before her, a velvet box containing a sparkling diamond ring held trembling in his hand. He spoke of their shared future, of growing old together, of a love that transcended age and circumstance. Eleanor, caught up in the moment, her heart overflowing with a mixture of joy and disbelief, accepted his proposal. The wedding was a small, intimate affair, just as Julian had suggested. He claimed to have no living family, weaving a tragic tale of loss and hardship that resonated with Eleanor's own experiences. A quaint chapel, a handful of close friends, and a simple exchange of vows marked the beginning of their union. Eleanor, despite a lingering unease, a quiet voice whispering doubts in the back of her mind, pushed those anxieties aside, choosing to believe in the fairy tale she had so desperately longed for. The first 2 days of their marriage were a blur of blissful moments. Julian was the perfect husband, attentive, caring, and seemingly devoted to Eleanor's happiness. He filled her home with laughter and companionship, erasing the years of solitude and replacing them with a warmth she had almost forgotten. He cooked her favorite meals, surprised her with small gifts, and whispered sweet nothings in her ear, making her feel cherished and adored. But behind the facade of marital bliss, a sinister plot was unfolding. With each passing day, as Eleanor basked in the glow of her newfound happiness, the altered medication was taking its toll, silently weakening her heart, pushing her closer to the edge of a precipice she couldn't see. Julian, ever the attentive husband, watched and waited, his patience wearing thin, his eyes gleaming with anticipation as the final act of his cruel charade approached. 2 days after the wedding, the carefully constructed illusion shattered. They were having a quiet dinner at home, the soft glow of candlelight illuminating the dining room. Eleanor, radiant in a simple yet elegant dress, recounted a humorous anecdote from her past, her laughter filling the room. Julian, seated across from her, feigned amusement, his eyes holding a flicker of something cold and calculating beneath the surface. Suddenly, Eleanor's laughter ceased, replaced by a sharp intake of breath. Her face paled, her hand clutching her chest, her eyes wide with confusion and a dawning panic. Julian's feigned amusement vanished, replaced by a carefully crafted expression of concern. He rushed to her side, his hand resting on her shoulder, his voice filled with practiced alarm. "Eleanor? What's wrong? Are you all right?" Eleanor gasped, struggling to speak, her words choked by the tightening grip in her chest. I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her eyes pleading for help, for reassurance, for an explanation to the sudden, terrifying pain that was consuming her. Julian, still playing the role of the concerned husband, quickly reached for the phone, dialing emergency services, his voice steady but laced with a hint of desperation that made his performance all the more convincing. He spoke quickly, relaying the situation with a calm efficiency that belied the sinister truth of his actions. As they waited for the paramedics to arrive, Julian knelt beside Eleanor, his hand holding hers, his voice murmuring words of comfort, empty promises of a future they both knew would never come. He watched her struggle for breath, the color draining from her face, the light fading from her eyes, his heart untouched by the tragedy he had orchestrated. Inside, he felt nothing but a cold satisfaction, the culmination of a meticulously planned scheme nearing its fruition. The paramedics arrived, their presence a stark intrusion into the carefully crafted scene of domestic tranquility. Julian, still clinging to his fabricated persona, relayed Eleanor's medical history, omitting the crucial detail of her altered medication. He watched as they assessed her condition, their faces grim, their voices hushed and urgent. He followed them as they carefully lifted Eleanor onto a stretcher, her body limp and unresponsive, the vibrant red dress she had worn on their wedding day, now a stark reminder of the life that was slipping away. He rode with her in the ambulance, his hand resting on hers, his face a mask of grief, his performance flawless even in the face of such intense scrutiny. He answered the paramedics' questions with practiced ease, his voice choked with emotion, his eyes filled with manufactured tears. He was a grieving husband, devastated by the sudden and unexpected loss of his beloved wife. At the hospital, the doctors and nurses worked frantically, their efforts futile against the inevitable. Eleanor's weakened heart, unable to withstand the strain of the subtly altered medication, finally gave out. Julian was informed of her passing with a gentle touch on the shoulder, a hushed whisper of condolences. He collapsed onto a chair, his body racked with sobs, his face buried in his hands, a picture of utter despair. He had played this role before, and he knew exactly how to perform the part of the grieving widower, how to elicit sympathy and deflect suspicion. In the waiting room, surrounded by the hushed murmurs of concerned friends and acquaintances, Julian allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. His plan had worked. Eleanor was gone, and he was now the sole beneficiary of her considerable estate. He had played the game, and he had won. Or so he thought. Tira Harris, Eleanor's daughter, arrived at the hospital shortly after receiving the devastating news. A police officer by profession, Tira possessed a sharp mind, a keen eye for detail, and an unwavering sense of justice. Despite the strained relationship she had with her mother in recent years, a relationship strained by Eleanor's demanding career and Kira's own demanding profession, she felt a deep sense of loss, a profound ache in her heart that transcended their differences. From the moment she saw Julian, his theatrical display of grief, his perfectly timed sobs and pronouncements of undying love, struck a discordant note within her. Something felt off, a subtle dissonance between his words and his demeanor that triggered her instincts. She had met Julian only briefly before the wedding, but even in those fleeting encounters she had sensed something unsettling about him. A subtle shiftiness in his eyes, a carefully crafted charm that seemed too polished, too rehearsed. As she watched him, surrounded by sympathetic friends and medical staff, Kira couldn't shake the feeling that his grief was a performance, a carefully constructed facade designed to conceal a darker truth. She remembered the whispered rumors, the hushed conversations amongst her mother's friends about Julian's mysterious past. The vague and often contradictory stories he had told about his family and his background. Driven by a gut feeling, a nagging suspicion that refused to be silenced, Kira resolved to investigate. She knew it would be an uphill battle, a challenge to the official narrative of a sudden, tragic but natural death. But she owed it to her mother, to the woman who had sacrificed so much for her, to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. She would find out what really happened to Eleanor Vance, even if it meant challenging the charming facade of the man who claimed to have loved her. Kira's investigation began discreetly. She requested a copy of her mother's medical records, carefully scrutinizing every detail, every notation, every prescribed medication. She spoke with the attending physician, her questions sharp and pointed, probing for any inconsistencies, any anomalies that might point to something more sinister than a simple heart attack. She learned of Eleanor's meticulous approach to her health, her strict adherence to her medication regimen, the unlikelihood of an accidental overdose. Her suspicions solidified when the toxicology report arrived. The results were stark, undeniable. Eleanor had died from an overdose of her heart medication, a dosage far exceeding her prescribed amount. The report confirmed Kira's worst fears. Her mother's death was no accident. Someone had deliberately tampered with her medication, and all signs pointed to Julian. Kira delved deeper into Julian's past, her police training and access to law enforcement databases proving invaluable. She uncovered a trail of aliases, a series of fabricated identities that Julian had used to conceal his true nature and his disturbing history. With each new discovery, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, revealing a pattern of deception and manipulation that spanned years and multiple victims. She discovered that Julian Thorne was not his real name. He was a chameleon, a master of disguise who preyed on vulnerable women, charming them, marrying them, and then, through a series of carefully orchestrated accidents, inheriting their wealth. Eleanor was not his first victim. She was the fifth. 4 other women, all older, all wealthy, all recently widowed or divorced, had met similar fates shortly after marrying Julian. The pattern was chilling, undeniable. Julian was a predator, and Eleanor had been his latest prey. Armed with irrefutable evidence, Kira presented her findings to her colleagues. The pieces of Julian's meticulously crafted deception laid bare for all to see. The pattern of his crimes was undeniable. The similarities between Eleanor's death and the deaths of his previous wives too striking to ignore. Julian, sensing the walls closing in, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him, made a desperate attempt to flee. He withdrew cash, packed a bag, and under the cover of darkness, slipped out of Eleanor's house, his heart pounding in his chest, the fear of exposure fueling his frantic escape. But Kira had anticipated his move. She had alerted the authorities, and a surveillance team was already in place, monitoring his every move. As Julian sped away, sirens wailed in the distance, the flashing lights closing in, the net tightening around him. A tense car chase ensued. Julian weaving through the city streets in a desperate bid for freedom, his past catching up to him, the consequences of his actions finally bearing down on him. The chase ended abruptly. Julian's car cornered, his escape route blocked. He was apprehended, his reign of terror brought to an end, the mask of charm and deception ripped away, revealing the cold, calculating predator beneath. The trial was a media sensation. The story of the charming young husband who preyed on wealthy older women captivated the nation. Kira, a key witness for the prosecution, testified with unwavering conviction, her words painting a chilling portrait of Julian's manipulative tactics and his callous disregard for human life. The families of his previous victims, their voices united in grief and outrage, shared their stories, their testimonies echoing Eleanor's tragic fate. The jury, faced with a mountain of evidence and a chorus of heartbroken voices, delivered a swift and decisive verdict. Guilty on all counts. Julian was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, his reign of terror finally brought to an end. For Kira, the verdict brought a sense of closure, a bittersweet victory in the face of unimaginable loss. She had honored her mother's memory, ensuring that justice was served, that Julian's crimes would not go unpunished. But the scars of his betrayal remained, a constant reminder of the price of misplaced trust and the devastating consequences of unchecked greed and deception. As she left the courtroom, Kira looked towards the sky, a silent promise to her mother echoing in her heart. Eleanor's story would not be forgotten. It would serve as a warning, a testament to the importance of vigilance and the enduring power of truth.